She told her followers she was the female reincarnation of Jesus, and they believed her. Children were stolen, heads were shaved, LSD was handed out like candy. And that's just the beginning. Today, we're diving into some of the most disturbing female cult leaders in history, the ones who didn't just control lives, they destroyed them. Before we go further, let me know in the comments, what's the most unbelievable true crime fact you know? Something that made you stop and say, wait, that actually happened? And if dark true stories are your thing, hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more coming. Anne Hamilton-Byrne, Australia. Cult. Name? The Family. The girl's voice was barely audible through the static. Something's wrong. They're not waking up. Dispatch asked her to repeat herself. But by the time officers arrived at the Lake Eildon property, the only thing louder than the silence was the sound of children crying behind locked doors. Inside the remote Victorian compound, nothing made sense. Bowls of uneaten food sat on the floor. A record player skipped endlessly in the background, caught in the loop of some soft choral hymn. Thin mattresses were lined wall to wall, each one holding a child with white blonde hair and identical gray uniforms. Most were dazed, some unconscious. One had a nosebleed. None of them asked for their parents. Police and child protection officers moved through the house with careful steps and quiet disbelief. A glass cabinet labeled vitamins contained vials of diazepam, mogadon, and several marked only with handwritten codes. Syringes, white pills, plastic bags with children's names written on masking tape. But no toys, no books, and no sign of the woman who ran the place. She wouldn't be found there that day, but her presence, her control, was everywhere. Her name was Anne Hamilton-Byrne, and these were her children, or so she told everyone. Anne wasn't the kind of cult leader who screamed fire and brimstone. She didn't need to. She whispered salvation through a smile, styled her hair like Jackie Kennedy, and floated through high society circles while telling her followers she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, but as a woman returned to cleanse the earth. And for a long time, they believed her. Doctors, lawyers, midwives, even social workers. They helped her build this cult. They helped her steal these children. Most of the kids found in that compound had been illegally adopted, handed over by women, loyal to the group, or fraudulently registered under false names. Once inside, they were given matching clothes, had their hair bleached to icy blonde, and were told they were the chosen. Chosen for what? Obedience, perfection, punishment. Anne didn't just isolate them from the outside world. She erased it. There were no birthdays, no affection, no concept of family outside of Mother Anne. If they disobeyed, there were beatings. If they questioned, there was silence. If they cried, there was medication. One former member would later describe it this way: if you asked too many questions, they'd call it spiritual confusion and give you another pill. What made Anne especially dangerous wasn't just her control. It was how normal she looked. To the outside world, she was an elegant, soft-spoken woman with perfect posture and a soft British accent. To her inner circle, she was divine. She preached that the end of the world was near, and only the spiritually pure would ascend. And purity, in her mind, meant complete obedience. It also meant regular doses of LSD, to adults, to children. Some of the followers believed the drugs were sacraments, that they were cleansing rituals. Others just went along with it, because Anne said it would bring them closer to God. One child, years later, would recall seeing adults curled up on the ground during a group session, shaking, crying, speaking in tongues, while Anne stood calmly in the center, hands raised, as if conducting an invisible orchestra of suffering. She never called it abuse. She called it preparation. For what exactly? She never fully explained. Anne didn't leave behind sermons. She left behind scattered tapes, cryptic journals, and meticulously organized documents, aliases, false birth certificates, medical files, and photos, so many photos, rows of identical children standing perfectly straight in front of a pale blue backdrop, each child looking into the lens like they were waiting for permission to smile, and never got it. When authorities finally began to connect the dots, Anne disappeared. She had passports under multiple names and loyal followers with offshore bank accounts. She was gone for years. But even in her absence, her influence held. Some followers refused to believe she'd done anything wrong. One woman, during a custody hearing, simply whispered, "Mother Ann knows what's best, even now." No one ever found out exactly what was in the capsules the kids were given that day, or what would have happened if that girl hadn't made the call. All that was left was silence, and the sound of the record still skipping, soft, endless, like a lullaby that refused to end. Terri Hoffman, USA, cult name, conscious development of body, mind, and soul. He was found sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing a mirror, with a spiral-bound notebook in his lap. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. Just one line scribbled over and over again. "I release this shell to the masters. I go willingly." Paramedics said the cause was clear, a fatal mix of sedatives. But the rest of the apartment told a stranger story. An altar made of white candles, arranged in the shape of a diamond. A necklace with a red stone at the center, wrapped tightly around his wrist, and on the dresser, a cassette tape still spinning, someone's voice repeating softly, "You are not the body, you are not the mind. The time has come to transcend." This was the fourth unexplained passing that year. Each case was wrapped up quickly, each ruled as a deliberate departure, but with no evidence of distress, no clear motive, just ritual-like consistency. Back at headquarters, detectives began connecting names. Some of the individuals had once lived together, others had been romantically linked, but they all shared a common thread. At some point, they had been under the influence of a woman named Terri Hoffman. To the outside world, Terri was a spiritual teacher. She hosted weekend seminars with titles like Awaken the Inner Light and Conscious Development of the Soul. She sold cassette tapes, guided meditations, and protection jewelry. She always spoke softly, dressed in flowing robes, and always smiled, like someone who already knew the ending. But within her inner circle, she was far more than a teacher. She was the gateway to salvation, a woman who claimed to have lived countless lifetimes, met beings from higher realms, and developed direct communication with the masters, enlightened entities guiding the universe's fate. She told her students that this life, it was a temporary illusion, that the body was a shell, and that she could guide them safely to the next plane. With that promise came rules, daily meditation, ritual cleansing, isolation from outsiders, and most importantly, complete trust. Her followers were told that if they wavered in belief, dark forces would notice. The Black Lords, as she called them, malevolent entities that fed on doubt. If they attached to you, your soul could be trapped between lifetimes, forever. To prevent this, Terri sold them spiritual shields, handcrafted jewelry said to hold protective energy. Not accessories, not merchandise. They were sacred armor. More than one former follower recalled sleep deprivation, vivid nightmares, and an overwhelming fear of being watched. Many said they couldn't rest without Terri's voice playing on loop. One described it like this: "It wasn't brainwashing. It was something softer, something you asked for." They trusted her, and then, one by one, they started disappearing. A woman named Sandy, newly divorced, once vibrant, was found lifeless in her bathtub. No signs of foul play, no struggle, still wearing her protection necklace. A young man named David had stopped eating. He'd been withdrawing for weeks. He left a note, barely 2 lines. "I'm not afraid. The path is open." In each case, no one found evidence of wrongdoing, but always, just beneath the surface, was Terri, her teachings, her voice, her signature on insurance forms. Because many of her followers had done more than just listen to her, they named her as a beneficiary. Some altered their wills. One woman even handed Terri control of her estate, just weeks before her car was found at the bottom of a ravine. It wasn't enough for investigators to charge her. She never directly encouraged anyone to leave this life, but she did make them feel like it wasn't the end. She made them believe it was progress. In interviews, she would say, "We are all just passing through. Some have finished their work sooner than others." One follower, shortly before his own death, told a friend, "This world isn't the real one. Terri showed me that. I'm just going ahead." By the time her organization faded, at least 10 people in her inner circle had passed under unusual, self-initiated circumstances. No charges were ever filed, no convictions, but the pattern remained, disturbingly consistent and quietly devastating. One investigator kept a copy of her seminar flyer taped inside his desk drawer for years. On the back, scribbled in pencil, were the words from one of her recordings, "Don't fear the end. It is only the end for those who don't listen." And to this day, no one knows how many did. Magdalena Solís, Mexico, the High Priestess of Blood. The first officer on the scene didn't speak for several seconds. His flashlight, cutting through the dusk, landed on what looked like a body, barely clothed, motionless, in the middle of a crude circle painted in red. 2 others were sitting nearby, eyes wide open but unfocused, swaying gently like children who'd been rocked too hard. One of them was humming. The other just kept whispering the same word, "Diosa, Diosa, Goddess." No one expected to find an altar. Charred wood, chicken bones, a rusted dagger, wrapped in cloth. The entire clearing was marked with makeshift symbols, some etched into the dirt with sticks, others painted onto stones in something too dark and thick to be paint. A tree trunk had been carved into a totem. At its base lay a small bowl, still warm. Survivors didn't run. They stood in place, staring or shaking, not with fear, but as if waking from something deeper. One woman was clutching a book, pages soaked. Another tried to crawl toward the fire pit, whispering about forgiveness. The local police weren't trained for this. This wasn't a crime scene. It was something older and colder. But that's when her name came up. Not in any police report, not from a government agency, from the followers. When asked who led them, they didn't say leader or priest. They said goddess. Magdalena Solís. By the time authorities pieced together what happened, Solís had already become more than a leader to the group. She was their divinity. Her arrival wasn't planned by her. She was brought in to play a part. A figurehead for a scam meant to extract money from desperate villagers, promising spiritual enlightenment through ancient Aztec rites. But something shifted. Once Solís took on the role, she never stepped out of it. It began with candles and chants. It ended with offerings. She called herself the Reincarnate, Goddess of the moon and blood. Her voice was soft, steady, almost maternal, especially when she described how purification required pain, how the body could carry sin like a sponge, how certain elements had to be drained to cleanse the soul. Villagers believed her. One woman claimed that looking into Solís's eyes felt like entering a trance. Another said she saw light beams radiate from her skin during ceremonies. Men surrendered their families to her. Women brought their children. For weeks, the group isolated deeper into the hills. No outside contact, no food seen entering, just drumming, singing, and eventually screams mistaken for worship. The rituals changed. More elaborate. Symbols more complex. Solís claimed divine visions told her who was impure, and the impure had to be removed. Not from the group, but from themselves. Followers were told to release their weight, unburden their flesh, prepare for ascension. Some never returned from the inner circle. Others did, but wouldn't speak. At first, locals chalked it up to fringe religion. But then people went missing. 2 boys, a young couple, one mother who hadn't collected her market stall earnings in weeks. That's when whispers turned into calls, and calls brought the officers to that clearing. Solís never resisted when she was found. She was calm, even as survivors pointed to her as the orchestrator. One follower clung to her, begging to be taken with her. Another wept, saying they weren't done ascending. In court, Solís spoke very little. When asked if she believed she was a goddess, she answered only, "I never lied." The rest of her testimony was redacted or deemed too disturbing for public record. Fragments of her teachings were later recovered from journals and spoken testimonies. She claimed the Aztec gods had never left, only changed form. That true salvation meant undoing what the modern world had built. She preached that pain was the highest form of offering, and that to offer pain willingly was to transcend. Some of her drawings were childlike, stick figures with halos of red. Others were anatomical, cold, almost surgical in detail. One page simply read, "They begged to be chosen." Even after her arrest, a few followers refused to accept the outcome. One woman showed up at the courthouse in ceremonial white, with red paint streaked under her eyes. She shouted as they led Solís away, "You don't cage a goddess, you only delay her return." To this day, no one knows exactly how many ceremonies were performed, or how many were lost. The main key-shift altar was burned by officials, but some say the clearing still draws people. That faint drumming can be heard just before sunrise, and that if you listen close, you'll hear someone whisper, "Diosa." Lenshina, Zambia. Cult name, Lumpa Church. The call came just after sunrise. Static crackled over the radio as the voice on the other end tried to stay calm. "There are people lying everywhere. Some are still chanting. Others, they're just not moving." By the time local authorities reached the settlement, the air was already thick with smoke and dust. Makeshift flags fluttered over mud walls. The gates were open, not broken, just waiting. Inside, it was chaos without sound. Dozens of bodies lying under white cloths, faces pale, arms crossed over chests. Others wandered barefoot, dazed, whispering fragments of scripture and songs that didn't belong to any known church. A line of men stood in formation near the altar, heads shaved, eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon. They refused to speak, refused to move. In the center of it all, a massive clay basin sat cracked open, surrounded by broken gourds, dried bloodstains, and torn Bibles. There was something carved into the floor beneath it, over and over. "She is not gone. She waits below." What started as a routine investigation became something else entirely. No one was prepared for the scale of it, the devotion, the discipline, the absolute surrender. It wasn't just a gathering, it was a movement, and it all traced back to one woman. Her name was Lenshina. To most of the country, she had once been a humble woman from a rural village, soft-spoken, unremarkable. But to those who followed her, she was more than a leader. She was a prophet, a bridge between worlds. They believed she could speak to spirits, see the invisible, and even return the breath to those who had passed. Her church, the Lumpa Church, started quietly. A few visions here, a few healings there. But soon, she began preaching messages that drifted far from anything in the Bible. She claimed the official churches had become corrupt, that the government was under a dark veil, and that salvation could only be found through her path, a path of total separation. She renamed her followers Lumpa, the pure. They were not to mix with outsiders, not to vote, not to obey worldly laws. They built their own communities, buried their own dead, and waited for Alice to awaken the chosen ones. Some say she never raised her voice, that she didn't need to. When she entered a room, the singing stopped, the children went quiet, and grown men fell to their knees. She often dressed in white, carried a staff carved with tribal markings, and spoke only in proverbs and prophecy. "The world will end, not in fire," she once said, "but in confusion, and I will be the one who brings the understanding." But confusion was exactly what followed. Her sermons grew darker. She spoke of war in the spirit realm, of needing soldiers who would not fear pain or doubt. Followers were made to train in secret, to swear loyalty over bone dust and silence. She warned them that the enemy was coming, and when it did, they must not open their gates, not even if their families begged. When authorities tried to intervene, they were turned away. Later, when they tried to enter by force, they found resistance they never expected. The aftermath would be recorded in whispers. Whole villages emptied, tunnels beneath the main church lined with clay effigies and handwritten prayers, rooms filled with empty beds, as if people had simply vanished. Alice herself was nowhere to be found. Some said she had gone underground, literally into the tunnels her followers had dug. Others believed she had finally ascended. But deep inside her chambers, one thing was left behind: a recording, an old tape, worn with time. On it, her voice, calm, slow, and unshaken. "They will say I led them wrong, but I only gave them the door. If they walk through it, they did so with their eyes open." That tape was the last confirmed trace of Alice Lenshina. No one knows what happened to her body. Some say it was hidden. Others claim she is simply sleeping, waiting for the day she promised would come, the day the dead rise clean and walk again. And on the back of that tape box, written in marker, was a single word: soon. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, USA. Cult name: Church Universal and Triumphant. A metal door slammed shut somewhere deep underground. The signal was faint. Someone using a hidden phone line to reach the surface. "Something's wrong," the voice whispered. "They're not waking up." By the time federal agents made it past the icy Montana roads, the air above the bunkers was still. No smoke, no alarms, just a long, sloped path leading down into a series of cold steel doors, half buried in snowdrifts. What waited below was silence, but not the peaceful kind. Inside the compound, lights flickered weakly. A faint hum echoed from the generators. Dozens of rooms had been carved out, small concrete cells stacked with survival kits, old radios, faded flags. The walls were covered in handwritten charts predicting global catastrophe, timelines, blast radius maps, evacuation drills. In one chamber, empty beds were lined up wall to wall, plastic bottles scattered across the floor. Some people were curled up, shivering, wrapped in blankets, their eyes wide but unfocused, like they were still waiting for an alarm to sound. In the center of the facility, there was a chapel, its walls painted in gold and deep violet. At the altar, an old cassette player sat spinning, looping a woman's voice over and over. "I am the messenger. I speak for the light. When the fire rains down, only the faithful will remain." That voice, calm, commanding, unmistakably certain, belonged to Elizabeth Clare Prophet. She was once a schoolteacher, polite, educated. But something changed after she met her husband Mark. Together, they founded the Church Universal and Triumphant, a spiritual movement they claimed was guided by ascended masters from other realms. After Mark passed, Elizabeth declared herself the sole vessel, the one true messenger. She didn't shout, she didn't threaten. Instead, he prophesied carefully, methodically, the end of the world. Not symbolically, literally. She said a nuclear strike was coming, that the U.S. government had already fallen, that hidden enemies would wipe the slate clean, unless her followers listened. So they obeyed. They sold their homes, left their jobs, and moved to the middle of nowhere. They built bunkers, trained in drills, stored food, cash, weapons, all to prepare for the day she warned about. To the outside world, it looked like paranoia. Inside, it was presented as destiny. She called it the shelter cycle, and she had a schedule, countdowns, meditations, broadcasts recorded in her own voice, instructing her people how to align their energies to deflect incoming spiritual attacks. "The light must meet the flame," she said, "or else the darkness will reign for 1,000 years." What made it more unsettling was how ordinary she seemed. A small woman with a calm smile. She dressed like a teacher, spoke like a poet. But behind that softness was a belief system that demanded total surrender. Families were separated, some sent to different shelters to balance the energy fields. Children were made to chant purification verses for hours. Every canned good, every flashlight, every drop of water was catalogued, blessed, and stored according to her prophecy. Even when the government began quietly monitoring the organization, noting the rising stockpile of supplies and rising paranoia. She insisted it was part of the plan. "They will call us extreme," she said, "until the day they beg to enter our shelters. But the shelters never opened to outsiders, and the apocalypse never came. What did arrive was confusion, illness, malnutrition. Some followers refused to leave, convinced the end was just delayed. Others began to break down, mentally and physically, unable to process the dissonance between what they'd been promised and what remained. Elizabeth claimed she was still receiving transmissions, still guiding the faithful, but her voice had changed, tired, slower, and then, one day, it stopped completely. When investigators entered her personal chamsua, bare, they found walls lined with cassette tapes, journals filled with coded language, and a single painting. It depicted her standing beneath a burning sky, arms raised, not in fear, but in triumph. Tucked inside the frame was a note, handwritten, delicate. "The light has been passed on. When the next war begins, they will remember who warned them first." And across the bottom of the chapel door, scratched into the steel with the edge of a broken plate, were 4 words. "She told us to wait." Maria Devi Christos, Marina Tsvigun, Ukraine. Cult name, Great White Brotherhood. The sirens never reached the compound. There were too many people, too much noise, and no one seemed in charge. Inside the gates, dozens of barefoot followers stood motionless in a ring, arms outstretched to the sky, eyes shut tight, chanting something low and rhythmic. Nearby, others were weeping, rocking back and forth on their knees. And in the center of it all, a single figure on the floor, covered in gold cloth, unmoving. The first responders tried to push through. They weren't met with resistance, but with eerie, calm smiles. Nobody screamed. Nobody ran. And when asked what had happened, most gave the same reply. "She's ascending again. We're not allowed to interfere." The air inside the hall was thick with incense. Statues of angels and cosmic beings stood in the corners, wrapped in tinsel and wires. Candles burned low. Everything smelled like flowers and melted wax. It wasn't until someone noticed the shallow breathing of one of the younger women on the floor that the illusion started to break. Medical teams rushed in. Some of the followers tried to stop them, not violently, just confused. "You're ruining the moment," one whispered. "You'll block the transmission." They had been waiting for what she called the radiant hour. The moment when the old world would shatter, and only the purest minds would move forward. They believed it had already begun. Her name, at least the one she gave them, was Maria Devi Christos. Before all this, she was Marina Tsvigun, a Soviet journalist. But after what she described as a spiritual explosion in her body, she claimed to have ascended beyond the human plane. She wasn't just enlightened. She said she was the returned Christ, but in female form. In Ukraine, during a time of collapse and confusion, her message caught fire. She didn't offer stability. She offered transcendence. And the people who followed her weren't all lost souls. Many were educated. Some were former doctors, teachers, engineers, people whose lives had been uprooted after the fall of the Soviet Union. She gave them new vocabulary for their suffering. She called the chaos around them the black cloud. She said only the children of the light would survive it. They renamed themselves the Great White Brotherhood, not for race, not for politics, but for cosmic purity. They wore white robes, held mass marches, and stood silently in public squares, eyes raised to the heavens. Sometimes they'd appear without warning, surrounding government buildings or interrupting public gatherings. They weren't violent, but they radiated conviction, and when questioned, they would recite verses she had written herself. "The day of judgment has come. The stars have been moved. The temple is within you now." The woman at the center of it all, Maria, rarely raised her voice, but when she spoke, it was with complete authority. She claimed to remember previous lives as various divine beings. She predicted earthquakes, floods, and claimed to speak directly with celestial councils. To the outside world, it looked like performance. To those inside, it was a countdown. One former follower later said, "We weren't preparing for the end. We thought the end had already happened, and she was the only one who knew what came next. She once held a ceremony that lasted 3 days. No food, no sleep, just chants, silence, and waves of hypnotic teachings. By the end, dozens of people had collapsed from exhaustion. They said it was proof the transformation had begun. But the transformation didn't come, at least not the one they were promised. When authorities finally moved in to break up one of the Brotherhood's largest gatherings, they found children separated from parents, journals filled with prophecies, and detailed plans for a spiritual government to be established after society's collapse. Maria was calm during her arrest. She smiled in the photos. One officer recalled her saying, "This isn't the end. You're just playing your part." Even now, her teachings still circulate in small online circles, fragments of her speeches, remixed and republished as cosmic truth. But inside one of the commune's rooms, behind a curtain of prayer flags and a cracked mirror, investigators found a wall-sized mural. It showed her, surrounded by fire, holding a cross, Eastal heart. At the bottom, written in silver ink, was a phrase, "When the others fall, I will rise alone." Linda Greene, USA. Cult name, the Samaritan Foundation. A woman was found wandering barefoot outside a shuttered gas station in Sedona, Arizona, sunburned, mute, eyes wide open like she hadn't blinked in hours. All she had with her was a worn-out flannel shirt and a child's toothbrush clutched tightly in her fist. When officers approached, she didn't resist. She didn't speak. She just kept whispering one sentence under her breath over and over again. "We missed the call." She said we weren't ready. That same night, sheriff's deputies raided the nearby compound known by locals as the Ranch. The place looked deserted at first, too clean, no signs of a struggle, no signs of life. But the furniture inside had been stripped of its cushions. Cabinets were empty. Closets stood open. And in the main prayer room, beneath a giant hand-painted mural of a woman with a halo of golden beams, authorities found something strange. 12 dining chairs set around a long wooden table, each with a name tag, each with a glass of water, each untouched. There were no bodies, no blood, but something was very wrong. Neighbors had been reporting strange behavior for months. People coming and going at odd hours, chanting late into the night, fires that burned out too quickly. Then, silence. When authorities started digging through the Foundation's records, they realized most of the people listed as living at the ranch had no clear paper trail. No employment records, no bank accounts. Some hadn't been seen in over a year. And the woman they were all following, the one who called herself the Voice of God, was gone. Her name was Linda Greene. She wasn't a street preacher. She wasn't a televangelist. She was something in between. And somehow, she had convinced dozens of people to give up everything they owned, money, property, families, and follow her into the desert. That she had a direct connection to God, and only those who followed her instructions to the letter would survive the purge. And for years they listened. She called her group the Samaritan Foundation, but there was nothing gentle about it. Former members described a rigid ranking system, spiritual obedience measured in silence, sacrifice, and suffering. New recruits were forced into soul purification, a ritual that often involved fasting, isolation, and public confession. If someone hesitated, Linda would say they were holding on to their earth self. If they refused, they were cut off. No one knew what that meant, but no one ever saw those people again. She wore white almost every day. Long dresses, flowing scarves, pale gloves. She said it was the color of ascension. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. One follower later described it this way. She could look at you for 3 seconds, and you'd start crying. Not because she scared you, but because you realized you hadn't been faithful enough. Her doctrine was scattered, a mix of New Age beliefs, Christian prophecy, and her own invented language. She spoke often of the call, an event she said would come without warning, where only the pure would be taken. Taken where? She never explained. At one gathering she reportedly said, "God speaks to me in patterns. The flesh is illusion. Your attachments are chains. If you want to be saved, you must let everything go. And they did. Bank accounts were drained. Houses were sold. Marriages ended. They gave up their names. Some even surrendered custody of their children to the group. What's never been fully explained is how many people disappeared under her watch. Some estimates say 5, others closer to 20. Most of them were never reported missing, because they'd already been written off by family or had cut ties completely. Linda told her inner circle that when the call came, it would be a private cleansing, not for the world to see, not for those who doubted. And then, one day, she vanished. No confirmed sightings, no arrest, just rumors that she'd fled to, South America, or changed her name, or that she'd joined another spiritual sect under someone else's leadership. But there was one note, a single page left behind in the prayer room, hidden beneath the cushion of her chair. It read, "To be taken is not to die. It is to leave the shell behind and become the voice. You will not find me. I have been heard." And to this day, she hasn't been. Some wore long robes. Others smiled like mothers. But behind every soft voice and spiritual promise was a hunger for control and a trail of shattered lives. These weren't just women with strange beliefs. They were orchestrators of chaos, bending minds, breaking families, and sometimes crossing lines so dark they defy belief. But here's the real question. Were they true believers, or just brilliant manipulators hiding behind the veil of faith? Let us know in the comments. Which of these leaders shocked you the most? And do you think their followers were victims or accomplices? If this left you speechless, just wait. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime and cult history. Hit that bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because sometimes, the most dangerous leaders wear a smile.